Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another MassMedic webinar. I'm Brian Johnson. I'm the president of MassMedic, and I'm delighted to be with you this afternoon for another of our MedTech at Home series. This is a co-presentation between MassMedic and Sunrise Labs. We're looking all at MedTech at home and the key considerations of how you design, and also that was in our first webinar, and you can go find that on our YouTube page. And here we had such a great success on the first discussion, and we kept kind of bumping into these regulatory and reimbursement strategies discussions that we decided we would do it again. And I'm really pleased to be joined today by Jim Turner with Sunrise Labs, an old friend, Vicki Anastasi, and Justin Kelly, and he's from Novocure, and Vicki is now at VJA Associates. It is a pleasure to have everybody here with us. I wanted to just start with kind of a table setter of a question before we go into the presentations. Let me first sort of try to hold off at the pass a couple frequently asked questions we get. We are recording this webinar. It will be available to view, and we will be sending it out at the end of this webinar. We will also be able to send out a copy of the slides. You all should be in mute right now, or if you're not in mute, please put yourself in mute so that our presenters can talk without hearing the incredible sounds of your home. I know I have a loud house, so I'll be going on mute as soon as I've stopped talking. But let's kind of set the table here. MedTech at home, to me, is a really fascinating topic, because when I look at the COVID crisis and this new reality, and I keep trying to find the lessons that we've learned over the past 3 months and change, is that you can do 90% of your life out of your home. And I would like to just pose this to our panelists today, and we can talk about it before we jump into the nitty gritty. To me, it sort of begs the question, where will healthcare be? Well, I guess we might put yourself on mute. I would appreciate it. That wasn't my question, but where will healthcare be in 20 years? Will we be still using the hospital as we know it, or are we now glimpsing a tiny slice of our future? How much of the hospital and how much of our healthcare will we be doing ourselves rather than physicians? Maybe we can all take a turn on that. Jim, do you want to kick us off on that?
Sure. So as you mentioned, the speakers, this is a picture of everyone. Today's topics, we're going to be talking about the challenges and opportunities for risk mitigation of home devices, life cycle management, and special considerations. We'll also be talking about claims being made about devices being developed, classification, and special considerations. And then lastly, coverage, coding, and payment opportunities. Welcome, and thank you again for having me. I'm Jim Turner, Director of Software Development here at Sunrise Labs. So as Brian kicked us off and asked that question, my slide is essentially about risk mitigation for home devices and what are its challenges, what are its opportunities. And throughout the process, for those of you who are familiar with this, you probably know of IEC 14971, the standard for developing your risk mitigations. So you have a risk management plan, you have a hazards analysis, you might do, and that's all about identifying the risk. You might do a mod search. A mod search is there's a national database in which you can actually go in and look at similar devices that have been used that may or may not be having been put in a home before. But you can look at this search and find out what risks are presented to both users, clinicians, and to the patient. Cybersecurity, as you think about home, is a much bigger deal right now. How secure is your home? Do you have an open password into your modem and your cable box? I don't know. Other items that you have to think about on a high level is, when you start assessing this risk and think about risk controls, there's certain risks you don't want to take. You might want to be selective with which group you're going to identify with in your first release. So part of that, I think about age groups. Do you have a 15-year-old who's snappy with devices and technology, or do you have an 80-year-old mother, father, grandmother who's using this device? Or do you have somebody in between who's actually hasn't been using a lot of technology but may need this device? It's all dependent on the risk that you're willing to take into for your development, but also is dependent on how much effort you want to put into the first release. Maybe you can get 60% of your population, not 100%. That's probably pretty good. So when I also think about challenges with it and the various age groups, you also have to think about your space. Couple of projects I've worked on before is peritoneal dialysis. I've worked on diabetes pumps, quite different. One's fairly large, use a lot of liquid that's delivered to the home and then hung on hung on a pole and set up every day or every other day for using this device. Storage is huge. Where do you keep all that? I know the one company delivers it once a month to your home. So considerations of these, as Brian was asking, is important. That's part of your risk management. How are you going to manage, you think about technology risk, but there's a lot other risks. Sharp objects, heaviness of the device. I'll go back to the diabetes pump. They're actually quite complex. What do you do with the battery? Is it rechargeable? Is it not rechargeable? Can they fill the syringe? Can they not fill the syringe? What's going to happen? Do people understand the readings that they're getting? Yes, they might be diabetics, but they may or may not understand it, especially if their insulin levels are low. So there are a lot of risk issues that you have to take into account, and then you have to control that risk. And to control that risk, there's usually software, but there's also training might be involved. There's also changes to the hardware, changes to the electronics. All of these come into it. And through that all, you're actually creating requirements. Now, I'm talking about risk control. I'm talking about challenges, but there are also a lot of opportunities here, which is if you get to work, be at home, and have your therapy managed by you, I know I like to be in charge. I know I like to be the one holding that device and knowing what's happening with that device and knowing all about it. I'm not trying to rely on somebody else in a hospital or someone I can't reach. I'm able to have that device. I can look up a manual online. I know I'm technically savvy. I know I have a lot of biology in my background, and not everybody does. But there are a lot of people, and one of the things I talk about is when we were having a chat beforehand, I was thinking about my education, having biology, and I'm sure all of us have had biology in high school. That's different. My parents didn't have biology courses in high school, and the amount of technology and information available around that is critical. So one of the things you get by having devices at home is you can have increased compliance and increase activism. And what I mean by that, if you've ever noticed how active the diabetes management population is, they are pushing the forefront of technology all the time. They keep asking, why can't I have this? And it comes back to then you review the controls and you go back to identify your risks, you assess them, you go back to controlling them. So that's all part of this process. A couple other products that have been used at home, you'll hear later today from one of our speakers, and he's going to talk about Justin Novocure, and that's a home use product that they're using right now. And you also I've worked on wheelchairs before. Here's a device. It doesn't sound very sophisticated, but people fall out of them all the time. Talk about risk. Falling down a set of stairs. There's a lot of risk, but the rewards are usually more important than the risk. So you just have to assess that. And finally, one other device I'll talk about, which is a Zeo patch. It's a 1-lead EKG. It's a Holter monitor. That's all it is. But what's the difference? It's 24 hours, and it's about the size of a pen that fits on your chest. Why is that important? Because you're using it, you put it on your chest, it's got a little button on it that you press, and then when you're done at the end of 2 weeks, you actually send it back to the facility, doctors read it, and then send it back. The only thing that I would want different in that entire control is I want the results sent to me before they get sent to my doctor, or simultaneously. I don't want my doctor to have to read them. Life cycle management. We're talking about medical devices, and there really isn't much different between developing this device at home for a home use versus developing it for a clinical use. But there is, and we talked about the risk management, but it's also, if you've ever seen, this is one presentation of the life cycle management, but I want to talk about another view, which is the V model. And I'm sure many of you have heard about the V model before. On the left-hand side is the V of the V, you have the user needs. And then coming down the left-hand side, you would have system requirements created. And continuing down, you would have a system architecture. And after that, you would create software requirements or mechanical requirements, electrical requirements. And from there, you would have architectures for each of those. And then from there, you might have detailed design or drawings. And then at the bottom, you have implementation. In the middle of this V, you have plans, you have tests. Well, if I look at all of this with the presentation that I have up, and I think about the V model juxtaposed with it, they're the same. The point that I want to make is that when you start thinking about a home use, the places where you're going to spend a lot of your time is actually on the concept phase, the user research phase, and the feasibility phase. What do you have to do to change the thinking about this product? How do you have to make it so this product can be used at home? And a couple of the words I have over there are software upgrades and recalls. That's a very big consideration that you will have when you want to look at developing a medical device at home. And going back to my V model, when you run this trial that the FDA would ask you to do, a clinical trial, I have been involved with some trials at home for both a peritoneal dialysis and a diabetes pump. It's interesting to do that. Most of the users that you choose are going to be rather sophisticated. And it's important that they're sophisticated, but it also changes your thought process about who you're going to be using, because if they're well educated, they may not be accurate indicators of how well your device can be used. But you do need to start with them the first trial to make sure that the product actually can work. For a good population, you don't want the first users to be uneducated and difficult to train and make your rollout difficult. So focus on the concept phase, the user research phase, and the feasibility phase. And while you're thinking about that, also focus on how are you going to upgrade the software? Are you going, one device that I'm familiar with, they actually send the whole device back home when they want to, back to the manufacturer, when they want to support it and upgrade the software. One of the wonderful things that the FDA does is if there's a cybersecurity recall, you're able to update that software immediately. So think about that when you're thinking about proof of concept, your feasibility, your architecture, and how that's going to all play out. Now, one of the things I didn't talk about here was all the standards. I'm going to just list them off there. There's 13485, there's 14971, 62304, 60601, 61010, 62366. Why do I mention all of these? Because each one of these or all of them are going to be relevant to the product that you're making. So while you're going through this process, all of them will be utilized. And lastly, I want to talk about special considerations and go back to Brian's question, which is, he was asking about, has COVID changed anything? And I believe the answer is yes. I think telemedicine is going to change things. My wife's a nurse. She has been for years, probably 5-6 years now, sending home O2 sensors, blood pressure cuffs, to her patients in order to provide, as well as a tablet, to provide screening for physicians to be able to monitor their patients who can't get to the hospital, because a lot of her patients were elderly or homebound. So it's here. One of the things that I find interesting is, where is the world going to be? I told you before, I'm very technology savvy and I like biology. I love the numbers. I love reading about the example that I gave the group before that we started was creatinine. You know, if it's greater than 1.2 for women, it's probably too high. If it's greater than 1.4 for men, it's probably too high. This is a kidney test. Most people may or may not know that. Are those numbers critical? Yes, they actually are. I find it fun. Not everybody will. So there's going to be this, what is home care going to look like? One of the things that I was telling a coworker is and I briefly mentioned it at the start of this presentation, I want control of my data. Oddly, I can't get most of the data that I want to see, even through these portals that we have. Much of the data is too large. You know, images aren't stored so I can see them, but it's my data. So ownership of data is interesting. The other piece of that is cybersecurity and access to that data. We use a process, part of the NIST, took the NIST 800.30 and created an FMEA process for cybersecurity to identify and conduct a risk assessment for information security. And it's a very interesting process to go through. It's very detailed, it's very time consuming, but it actually is important because, and I mentioned it before, you send data home or these devices home, are they secure? Probably a lot of them aren't. So what does that mean? How are we going to take care of that as we develop these medical devices for home? And then HIPAA, for those who don't know, it's actually the Health Information Portability and Accountability Act of 1996. It essentially says your data's private. Well, as we develop at my company, software for the cloud, we make sure that we are using technology in the cloud that is actually HIPAA compliant, or we can design it and architect it to be HIPAA compliant. That's critical to this. And so when you're thinking about having devices at home, you are able to develop the proper device and the proper controls to allow telemedicine, to allow cybersecurity and HIPAA. It's a complicated world out there as we move home. And not everybody, I mean, this is the other piece, not everybody has enough equipment at home. Some people, especially the elderly, they may or may not have a phone. That's one of the issues that my wife has had to deal with as a visiting nurse. There are literally people without phones. And she actually has had to call family members in order to schedule appointments. How does that work in this world that we're coming to with a lot of people who don't have phones? Or we're in Bedford, New Hampshire, Londonderry, New Hampshire. I called someone on my team yesterday. Their phone didn't work. And they're 100 feet from the cell tower. It's just the way the radio waves are set up. She doesn't have connectivity with her cell phone. These are all true issues, and it affects telemedicine, HIPAA, cybersecurity. With that, I'm going to pass it on to Vicki.
Thanks, Jim. Okay, I think we can go to the next slide.
Oops.
Okay. So I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about what is a home use device. So the FDA is very clear. There's many guidances. They've been working on this for a long time now. And one of the things is that it's for use in the home, which means outside of the professional healthcare facility. And it's a patient, the user is a patient, caregiver, family member. So it can be a variety of things. And as we were talking earlier, there's a lot of things that we are all aware of that are devices. The pregnancy test was one of the first diagnostic tests that many of us are familiar with that was a home use device. And now we've seen the tremendous advances in glucose monitoring that is used today in diabetes care. And now the complex infusion pump systems that are in our homes. We look at what's happening in the cardiothoracic area, from the simpler products like Holter monitors up to taking care of congestive heart failure patients at home. So the devices are for diagnosis, treatment, and monitoring. And the claims are very important as you start looking at developing your product and going to the FDA, because your claims will define your human factor studies that are required to show that it can be used safely and as intended in your home. To go to Brian's question earlier, what we're seeing and what COVID has triggered is an incredible increase in the evaluation of what products can be used in the home and which ones should be used in the home. And the FDA is open to and having conversations with the industry about how to safely and effectively move more things into the home. What we're seeing today, or I've seen today in the last few months since COVID, is an increasing amount of diagnostic tests that could be done at home with either a swab or something like a finger prick versus sending patients into healthcare facilities. So is that here to stay? I think many people would believe it is. If you can get a kit at home and you can do it yourself and send it back. And then we run into the very important questions of HIPAA and the right patient being screened and things like that, which will come out of in the design and validation of the product. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So to continue this conversation, I think it's important to look at device classification. So the home use devices are across the platform as far as classification. They can be simple class 1 all the way up to class 3 products. Software is a key component, obviously, for home use devices, and there could be minor, moderate, or major categories. There's also software itself, which is a medical device. So software as a medical device is now a key aspect of many new technology that's being developed for use in the home. Correctly classifying the product, inclusive of the software, is critical at the initiation or design of the product. It's the pathway and corresponding test plans also should take into account whether this is being paired with another product or whether it's for diagnosing, treating, or monitoring. One of the things, as we were discussing earlier today, is the use of at-home products in clinical trials. So as we're in the middle of this pandemic, one of the things that has slowed down tremendously is clinical trials in health centers. And of course, clinical trials are critically important to getting new and emerging technologies on the market that are life-saving, that are key for our health and well-being. And so how do we do this in this era? And what we're seeing is a heavy reliance on home health devices for conduct of clinical trials. So everything from informed consent through treatment, through monitoring, now is being looked at is how do we do this with products that can be used at home? It's a whole new era. The current theory is that it will not go away, that as we begin to be smarter about how we're doing clinical trials and enable more clinical trials to be done in the home setting, we need to use all technology and all available devices to continue to allow products to collect data and go to the FDA to go out on the market and be life-saving or monitoring life-threatening conditions. You can go to the next slide. One of the things I wanted to touch upon quickly during my time here was emergency use authorizations. Everyone is talking about it right now because we're seeing it probably more than we've ever seen it in our history. There's definitely more attention due to COVID. It's been in place since 2017. It is expected that over the next 12 months minimally, that more devices and diagnostics and therapeutics will become available via this pathway. The future use of this pathway will depend on the need and also the review of the data of the products post-market that are made available through EUA. So one of the aspects that I think is important to understand that this is a very quick turnaround. It's being used very successfully right now, but there also is the requirement to monitor the use and the data collected to ensure that the products that were put forward on the market are meeting the intended use and meeting the true mission of this, which is for public safety and health. And I think with that, I turn it over to Justin.
Thanks, Vicki, and thank you everyone for your time today. What I'd like to do is spend a few minutes just talking about the reimbursement considerations as it relates to home use devices. And for the talk today, I'm going to focus in on a specific benefit category called durable medical equipment. So for reimbursement vocabulary purposes, there's three key terms that we typically use when we're discussing coverage and payment and coding. Coverage is really based on the strength of the clinical data, and that is how we articulate our value proposition to payers to convince them that the device or the treatment is effective, as well as supported in peer-reviewed literature. Coding is the language that we use to identify products, services, procedures, and in the reimbursement world for home use devices, those typically fall within the level 2 CPT code, also known as a HCPCS code. And then the last piece is payment. So you have coverage, you have the language to be able to communicate to a payer what product or service you're using, and then there's the payment piece. And CMS has multiple ways to price HCPCS codes, specifically in the durable medical equipment space, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail in just a moment. Next slide. So I think this is one of the most important slides that I'll share with you today, especially as you're thinking about how you bring a device to market. It's really important to understand how Medicare looks at items that are used within the home. And this is the specific criteria that they adopted in 2012. And, first off, for an item to be considered durable under the Medicare standards, it has to withstand repeated use. The second bullet point here is probably the most important, is that it has a minimum useful life of at least 3 years. If your device is coming to market, obviously after January of 2012, and you don't have an expected life of at least 3 years, CMS will not consider that a durable device. There are plenty of devices that are currently on the DME fee schedule that do not have that expected life of at least 3 years, but those were grandfathered in. So today, you have to be able to show that your device has an expected life of at least 3 years. And that's typically demonstrated to Medicare through a warranty that you would provide documentation to when you're going through the coding process. The third criteria is that it's primarily used for medical purpose and is generally not useful in the absence of an illness or injury, and obviously is appropriate for use in the home. So this is something that patients should be able to operate, obviously with appropriate training, but once they've been trained to be able to operate that independently without continuous medical supervision. Next slide. So I'll spend some time talking about the different pricing mechanisms that CMS has. And it's important that when you're beginning to design your products and go through the regulatory process, that you keep the reimbursement aspects in mind, especially if you're looking to use this as a DME. The way Medicare looks at pricing durable medical equipment, the most common way is through a process called gap filling. And that is looking at comparable products on the DME fee schedule already. So if we were to, let's say, come up with an insulin pump that had some significant new features, it was easier to use, Medicare is going to look at that and comparably price it to what's existing on the market. So you have multiple different models of insulin pumps, for example, they all use the same HCPCS code and all have the same fee schedule. So it is important to remember that Medicare will look at the function, not feature of the product when they're looking at how they're going to price this. They also have some other mechanisms that they typically don't use anymore, including one for products that don't fall within that don't compare to an existing fee schedule product. They can actually take the supplier list price, deflate that to a $1986, and then they use a lower level of inflation called the covered item update, which is based on the consumer pricing index for urban areas to calculate increases in fees. And that typically results in a 25% discount off of your price. That said, CMS typically doesn't use that factor anymore, and they've actually put a new innovative payment model in place for home use devices, which would use your median of commercial contracted rates. And typically what they'll do is they'll take that median and then apply that deflation calculation and then reinflate it using the CPI-U. That truly is only available for products that do not have a comparable on the market. And, through personal experience, and I'll go into that in the next slide, CMS can kind of find ways to try to bring comparisons where there aren't any. So we can go to the next slide. Oh, there we go. So what I thought I'd do is kind of walk you through the Optune reimbursement milestones. As I was saying at the beginning, before most folks joined us, 9 years of hard work distilled on a slide. So I joined Novocure in 2011 when we got our approval for recurrent glioblastoma. And the Optune device is a portable device that delivers tumor treating fields, which are alternating electric fields that are delivered to the brain. Those fields disrupt the mitotic spindle formation in a dividing cancer cell, which leads to programmed cell death. In our initial trial, we did a randomized controlled study, which compared Optune as a monotherapy and recurrent glioblastoma versus physician choice chemotherapy. And in that study, we were able to demonstrate comparable outcomes to the chemotherapy arm, but we showed a much better side effect profile because the only device-related side effects with the treatment are mild to moderate skin irritation. We had our publication of that pivotal trial in 2012, and the first thing that we did in order to start the coverage process was work through the guidelines. So the way Medicare and commercial payers look at coverage, they're not just looking at the strength of your clinical data, they're also looking for acceptance in the medical community. And one of the ways you can demonstrate that is through treatment guidelines. And often there are many different guidelines available for many different disease states. In the oncology world, NCCN in the United States is the gold standard that payers look to. We were able to secure a consensus recommendation, and that allowed us to get our first commercial insurance policy, which was in 2013 with Aetna. At the same time, we had started the process of going through the HCPCS code process. So if you have an existing product or your product is comparable to an existing product on the market, you can go through a process called a coding verification, where one of the Medicare contractors that handles that will take your application and supporting documentation, determine whether or not there's an existing HCPCS code that would be appropriate for that. And then they publish that data to the Medicare administrative contractors, and they also will publish policy articles to let payers know what correct code should be used in that situation. When we went through our HCPCS code process, because there was no appropriate code, we were given a dedicated code, and we were classified as a specific type of DME called frequently serviced durable medical equipment, which basically bundles all the supplies, the support, the service that you have to provide under one code, and then bundles that payment under, so we get one payment that's all inclusive for everything the patient needs per month of treatment. At the same time that we got the code, the MACs, or the Medicare Administrative Contractors, had issued a negative coverage policy, and then CMS had gap filled and created a price for our therapy that compared Optune, which is an antimitotic cancer treatment, to a bone growth stimulator, because that was the only class 3 device that was on the fee schedule at the time. And so that started my career in government affairs, where I had to run from one side of Capitol Hill to the other to raise awareness about this issue, and Medicare did agree to pull down that price. At the same time, about 2 months after the MACs had issued their negative local coverage determination, our second pivotal trial in newly diagnosed glioblastoma was stopped at the interim analysis. And this was actually the first time that that's happened in a brain tumor trial. And the reason they stopped the trial was because the patients were receiving Optune plus temozolomide, where we moved it earlier in the treatment paradigm, were doing so much better than the patients who were receiving the prior standard of care, that the Independent Data Monitoring Committee recommended that the control arm crossover to receive the Optune device, and the FDA did approve that. We did get our second FDA approval in newly diagnosed glioblastoma in 2015, and then we had our publication of that pivotal trial, and then we went back to the National Comprehensive Cancer Network for them to review that, and we were granted a Category 1 recommendation, which is the highest level of you can get from the NCCN. In 2018, we had started the process of reconsidering our local coverage determination, and that took a year. And September of last year, we finally got Medicare coverage. So by the time we actually got Medicare coverage, I had every other commercial insurance company in the country approving and paying for this. And now Medicare has a way to appropriately price the treatment using our median contracted rates, as well as we have a favorable coverage policy from CMS. And just last year, we received our third FDA approval, and this is for our device called Optune Lua, which is a device that treats malignant pleural mesothelioma. So the sort of mechanism of action is the same. We are treating the MPM at a different frequency than we do a glioblastoma, and the arrays are placed on the chest as opposed to on the head. So I get to start this process over. We just got our pivotal publication from Lancet for MPM, and now we're starting the process with NCCN, and kind of what I like to call a rinse and repeat process in terms of seeking coverage and reimbursement for this innovative therapy. And with that, I will, that's it for my presentation.
Thank you so much. Justin, what required more advanced degrees? Creating the tumor treating fields to stop glioblastoma in its tracks, or trying to get it paid for?
Well, I think both both were both were impressive feats. It's I'd say obviously the invention of this innovative treatment was the most impressive, obviously, but taking something truly novel. And when I got this call from Novocure in 2011 about joining, I had to go through a process to really understand, does this treatment work? How does it work? I was working in oncology for a long time and had never heard of this before. And we have to navigate those discussions with payers. And, when you're trying to educate someone who has to pay you, for patients to receive that treatment, there's a lot of work that goes into that education process, and also understanding the different rules and processes and trapdoors that you can fall into, especially as you navigate the coding and payment process.
Right. So right now, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to submit a question, the best way to do it is submit it through the chat function. That should be in the lower part of your screen, and I'll be happy to read them out. I do have a couple questions that I'm very curious about, and Justin, and maybe and Vicki, because I know you have some experience here. I am very confused a little bit about this deflationary milestone that goes back almost 40 years. What in the world are they talking about?
So those were guidance documents that were written back in the 80s to sort of provide Medicare with a mechanism to provide, to price products. And then, once you've priced the product, you have to be able to, each year you get an increase or decrease for that matter, depending on inflation. And so, that's the mechanism that CMS has adopted to be able to price that. And when we went through that process, we were a single source supplier. We were the first ones and only people with this type of technology on the marketplace. And so there was concern, that they, didn't want to take a list price and deflate it to 1986 and then bring it back up. So they were looking at alternative mechanisms. And, our perspective from that was, well, you have your guidance documents that have been published. Obviously, if you're going to change them, there's a whole process to do that. But it really was a Herculean task to educate folks on the Hill, work with patient organizations, physician groups to build coalition to make sure that, this treatment would be available to Medicare beneficiaries like it was in the commercial marketplace.
And then what the 3-year time horizon for DME, is DME really the most clear pathway for home use medical equipment, or is there, is that sort of the paved road you have to take rather than trying to build your own road?
So yeah, the short answer is, if you do not meet the criteria for durable medical equipment, it becomes really challenging to get reimbursement from government or commercial payers because they really all look at that same sort of definition. The 3-year minimum useful life is demonstrated often through your package, your PIOM, your warranty that you provide. So it's important that when you're thinking about, a lot of times in my career as I've joined companies, I joined right after the reimbursement approval, the regulatory approval, and now they're like, okay, now you're going to get us paid. And there's a lot of work that needs to happen before you're, while you're designing the product, while you're going through the regulatory process, just to make sure that you're not, stepping in a landmine by mistake because of all the different rules and processes that are out there. But again, the 3-year rule is something that was passed in 2012. It is something that you have to follow today. And like I said, often it's just demonstrated in a warranty.
And that's the lifespan of the product itself, or does that apply to everything within the product? Because my computer is 5 years old and it's about, it's long in the tooth.
So the other piece of that is that, there are some considerations about the supplies and the that go along with the device. CMS has tried to move away from the razor blade model. So there are some challenges if the bulk of your cost of the device is in disposable supplies. That could also be a challenge. Those of you who are familiar with the continuous glucose monitor battles over the years, there were some challenges with CGMs that connected to phones because that made it not durable. A lot of those are getting sorted out, but it's not, working with the government, whether it's regulatory or payment side, it's a slow process. There's, many challenges that you can run into. And then, and when you have those come up, it can often lead to significant delays in getting to that final result, which is favorable coverage and payment.
Great. And I want to kind of pivot here. Vicki, you were talking about home pregnancy tests. And it made me sort of think about the burden of trust and the trust of the user to believe that the product will be right, if not every time, but the majority of the time he uses it, and B, am I using it correctly? Do home use medical technologies, how much of a burden of trust is there to overcome rather than say compared to a technology that you go into the hospital and the healthcare worker uses for you?
So I think Justin touched on this, but I would say it really goes back to the initial intent and the design. And you need to start at the beginning with understanding who's going to use it and what the results are going to be used for. And then that has to be part of your regulatory pathway so that ultimately you end up with reimbursement. But to go back to the intent of your question, it really needs to be built into the design, in the input into the design, the specifications. If it's going to be for a person at home who's going to take a test or use your device and then and then it's going to guide some sort of medical next steps, that has to be part of the way it's designed, and also the instructions for use, and then the testing along the design path that determine that are regulatory, critical regulatory data points that determine that it can be used at home and it is as reliable and trustworthy as if you went into a doctor's office and had the same testing done. I'm using testing as an example because you said pregnancy test. But even for medical devices, it's the same. You have to be able to prove that, and it needs to be designed in that way. So if something takes a licensed nurse 15 minutes and a lot of expertise to set up, and you're expecting a non-nurse at home to do it, you need to take that into account. It has to be designed differently. If it's to be used in a home by a nurse, then again, you have that parallel where you can say it's to be used by a healthcare professional at the home. So it's very much, that's I think what we're trying to impart with the three of us talking today, was this has to be from concept through design, through testing, in order to make it an effective home use product.
Right, and I guess that would put the onus on, sort of really thinking through the disease state that you're going to treat. I mean, I would imagine that a false positive on pregnancy is disappointing, perhaps for some, maybe a relief for others. But it's, you clearly have to go get more medical care, but it's not sort of a binary life or death type question where I think that would, that in the design of it, you probably want to think about how the news of that diagnostic will translate and what it will lead to. But maybe somebody else could think about how do you look at in that design phase, how maybe Jim, I don't know if you guys talk about it in your line of work, how do you kind of vet opportunities in the home healthcare space? Is there some sort of, how extensive is the process to decide which is a good product for the home versus in the healthcare setting?
So we're a services company, so we're not building products ourselves, but when clients come to us or potential clients, we do talk to them about it. And that's what I was implying before. Also, what is the home like? Is this apartment on the third floor where equipment's got to go up and down? Or is, we had a friend once who was in a wheelchair, and the state of Florida actually built ramps for a home free of charge. Something as simple as a wheelchair. I don't mean to imply it's not, but the entire home was modified. But yes, sorry, the dog's in the background. But
your co-presenter disagrees, Jim, or emphatically agrees. I can't tell.
So part of what you're implying is, yes, we do take into consideration all different things. And one of the things that Vicki was getting at was user needs. But one thing I'd like to add is you also have formatives and summatives, in that early in the process, you go through this process of, can I test this device with a individual that Vicki was talking about and you're talking about, age, conscious, cognitive ability, dexterity, just a lot of different issues that come up in everybody's life at every stage of their life. And it all does depend. And we have to then do the formative, design the system, and then look at the summative to make sure that we actually did build the product that we thought we did and it works.
Right.
So that's another component of it.
Hey, Vicki, I want to go back to those clinical trials and the collection of clinical trial data at home. Is there going back to that trust question? Are the data that is collected at home by the patient, is it treated with the same validity as data collected in the sort of testing center, healthcare center?
That's a key point because it has to be. So if the study will need to be set up in a way where the data is controlled. And I think what we're seeing with the advancements in technology, there are mechanisms to do that. Now, not every study can be done at home. You can do a lot of follow-up care at home. You can do a lot of treatments at home, such as pharmaceuticals or therapeutics, or type of products that are intended for the patient or a healthcare provider at home to use. There are things that are never going to be able to be done at home. I mean, you're not going to, and no offense to anyone who's in the orthopedic space on the call, but you're not going to do a knee replacement in your home.
Hope not.
No, but you can do follow-up care
Right.
at your home. So instead of going maybe to a rehab facility, do you put monitors on? Now there's monitoring equipment now that can be used to show range of motion, to show infection, to show things like that. So, you're starting to see the use of our advancing technology to move more patients into the home for more of their treatment. And if you're looking at clinical trials, today, just in the last few months, we've seen more clinical trials start at home and be initiated at home and be monitored at home. And does it require a different paradigm? It is. It's definitely more technology savvy. It's definitely more reliant on the transfer of data, which has to be safe and secure. But we are seeing that. And I think what you're seeing is companies collaborating with partners in order to make that happen, because people still want to get critical products on the market. And if we can't all go into a clinical study and our homes are becoming where we're doing a lot of our healthcare, then we have to look at the model for clinical trials at home when safe and appropriate and controlled. Right. And I think data protection and the ability to have the trust that it is the right data is critical. And that's what you're starting to see a lot of collaboration on, in my opinion, going forward.
Do you feel like the regulators are keeping pace with this? Do you feel that FDA and CMS are creating the appropriate gates that can involve?
I'm going to let my friend Justin talk about CMS. I will definitely talk about the FDA. Yes, the FDA. You may have more conversations prior to the start of a study, but yes, they realize, and when you, as you know, you've known me for a long time, as you called me your old friend, but yes, the FDA wants to help get these breakthrough products on the market. And if the current environment is we're doing more things at home, then I find that the calls I've had with them recently, they've been collaborative about what can be done at home, what can't be done at home. What is a critical data point? How can we get that done? So they're asking the questions and then listening when you have a solution. And then it's up to all of us to find a safe way to do it at home.
Justin, I don't want to put you on the spot. I know you got a lot of work to do, but no Buck Rogers is the old statement, right? So are the payment methods there to really fully bring innovation in healthcare to the home?
I think the answer to that is yes. There are avenues, but it's not a easy process, and it does take a significant amount of effort and work, especially if you're bringing something truly novel to the marketplace. There are a lot of different initiatives that CMS has, that are, like, for example, coverage with evidence development. So if you had a product that your clinical data was okay, or it wasn't enough, or wasn't relevant to the Medicare population because your sample size was under 65, you can go through this process where Medicare will actually run a trial, and you can work with them through this process. It does require you to go through the coverage analysis group through the national coverage determination pathway. It's a very lengthy process just to get to yes on that, but there are pathways available. In my experience, the two agencies, try to partner together, and they are looking at ways to foster innovation, especially bringing therapies and treatments to the home. But there still are challenges, navigating that process.
Okay. I want to just kind of close us out with a larger question. 100 years ago, we didn't have bathrooms indoors. We didn't have refrigerators. We might have ice boxes, right? But the things we did in our home are not the same as what we do today. Do either any of you see a period where we will have a space in our home dedicated to our healthcare entirely?
I think it depends on the age. I mean, where people need the most treatment is later in life or after severe disease.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think, yes, some people are going to continue to have home births, but you need the acute care ability of a hospital if there's a problem. No one's going to try and solve that on their own.
Right.
It's too hard. But later in life, yes. I mean, more and more people say they want to die in their home. So how do we facilitate that? How do we allow that?
Right.
I talked about peritoneal dialysis, which is a very difficult treatment, but that can be done at home. So I think there will be, and it is happening, right? We know people with peritoneal dialysis. We know people at home with hemodialysis. So yes, I think it will depend on people, but yes, I think there'll be more and more dedicated. The one question I wanted to ask people, which we didn't talk about, I know I'm throwing a monkey wrench and everything at the end of the hour, but which is machine learning and how that's gonna, Justin and Vicki, where is that going with this, technology and at home? I have my own ideas, but your thoughts?
A little light question in the hour here.
Yeah, I know, it's huge.
Want to take a stab at it?
I'll take a stab at it. I think, obviously data and analytics, are incredibly important in healthcare. And, I do think, there will be some opportunity for that, but I think it's still too early to know where that's going. But just over the past, 10 years, you start to see a lot of, home use devices. Like my dad's home from had open heart surgery, and I have a pulse oximeter to have my mom check his O2 and his pulse, in case, in between visiting nurses visits, in case there's any issues. So I do think that there's a lot of opportunity, especially in the home, not just maybe for treatment purposes like Optune or Optune Lua, but also for diagnostics, which can save patients trips to the hospital or to their provider's office where they could be exposed to various things.
Seems like a key enabling technology, doesn't it? If you're going to have people doing their own home healthcare, that they're going to need some assistance.
That's why I brought it up. Go ahead, Vicki.
I would say that I think monitoring long-term patient care at home is where I think you're going to see a lot, because it's going to come out of data and algorithms, and so you're going to be able to see trends, and it's going to give alerts, and in some cases maybe even send signals to doctors or nurses or even 911. And so I think we will see machine learning and AI become a factor in long-term monitoring and care. Jim, sorry, I don't know if I jumped in there, but that's my...
No, that's what I wanted. I wanted to hear your opinion. I have mine.
That's where I see it going, Brian.
That's great. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this hour flew by, and I want to thank Vicki Anastasi, Jim Turner, and Justin Kelly for joining us today. And I want to thank our friends at Sunrise Labs for putting on this second part of this MedTech at Home webinar series with us. Please stay in touch with Mass Medic. We're holding 2 to 3 online virtual programs a week. They're very easy to sign up, free for members, and we also welcome folks who are interested in joining our community to take a sample. So that's the last of our webinars for this week. Next week, we'll continue with our town hall, and we'll be doing this. Looks like we're going to be doing this for a while, guys. We're still working out of the house, but what an amazing thing that we can have this level of brain power join us from their homes, beam them into your homes, and we can all get smarter together. So thank you, everybody. Stay safe and be well, and have a great Thursday night. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.